It's time to get started on the building of the lightweight concrete potting bench, and the first part of this process will be casting the feet. I am going to cast the feet using normal concrete because I really don't care how much they weigh. Here is one of the finished feet, and now we'll go through the process of how I cast them. Here is the form in the 3D Inventor modeling environment. With the exception of the center plug, it is all made out of 18mm plywood, with the bottom being 2 layers to make it extra thick and stiff. This form has to last through a minimum of 4 castings. Now exploding the form into its 8 separate parts to see how it all goes together. The seams will be sealed with latex caulking to prevent anything from leaking out. Here are all the pieces for the foot form, and it has already been partially assembled. With the exception of the plug, all of the dimensions were not critical, so it was basically cut to fit. I cut the 2 pieces for the bottom of the form, laminated them together, and then cut to size for the shape of the foot. All of the sides of the form were then cut and sanded to fit. Each part is labeled with a number because the screws were match drilled and they'll only fit in one location. All of the individual parts were cut, sanded, drilled, and then coated with polyurethane to seal them up. Didn't want any of the water from the concrete to split apart all the plywood before I got 4 of these feet casted. Now that the form's fully assembled, it's time to seal up all the seams. Using standard household latex caulking, I'll run a bead across all of the seams all the way around the form, and then we'll use a damp rag to clean up all the caulking and make a nice fillet. The only reason for doing all this is to keep the concrete from coming out of the form. Previous times I've cast concrete and not sealed up the seams, we get a lot of the water and cement mix actually extruding out of the seams during the settling process. So this just makes cleanup much easier. The latex caulk is water-based, so I keep a wet rag handy to keep rinsing it out as the rag gets saturated with the caulking. Once I'm satisfied all the seams are sealed up, then we have to set it aside and wait for it to set before we fill it up with concrete. Here's a quick look of how everything's going together. I filled up the form with dry mixed concrete to find out exactly how much it's going to use, and that's what's there in the bucket. Next to the bucket is some water, down below is some super plasticizer and a little extra water. We don't know exactly how much water we're going to need for this mix. Also shown here is the rebar, how it's going to be positioned, as well as 2 pieces of hardware cloth for reinforcement. I made a pattern for the hardware cloth out of a piece of scrap wood so that I can cut the same size for each one of the 4 castings. But now before we start casting, I do have one experiment I'm going to try. For my little experiment, I've printed my name on a piece of plastic on my 3D printer. Here we're going to be gluing that down to the base plate, which is actually the side of the foot, and we're going to see if I can cast my name right in the concrete from the form. Grabbing a piece of paper out of a magazine and some typical spray-on adhesive, I spray it and then set it in place. Now here we go with the first pour into the first form to cast my first foot. I've already got the concrete mixed up. You'll probably notice it's a little dark colored because I'm using some charcoal colorant in the concrete. Dump in the first couple of scoops, and then you'll see my magic concrete vibrator being a simple oscillating tool that I discovered totally by accident a number of years ago. Later on, and I think it was in this project, I actually created a custom-made head for use as a concrete form vibrator. After those first couple of scoops have settled out, I'm trying to work out just exactly how I'm going to add the reinforcement. First, I was thinking the hardware cloth on the bottom and then set the rebar on top, but then I found that it would be better to put the rebar in first. you'll see that the concrete vibrator really settled it all out and I had to dig it in. Once I got the rebar right about where I wanted it, I added a little bit more mix on top and settled it down with the vibrator. Then add the hardware cloth and then top off the form using the vibrator once again to settle it all out. Once all screeded off and a few low spots filled in, we can see that a lot of that water has been squeezed up out of the mix by the vibration. As all the solids settle down and come together, it makes no room for the water, and that water should end up being sucked back down into the mix. So that's the first pour. Coming up, we'll find out what errors were made. Using the oscillating tool as a vibrator was discovered once when I was pouring a concrete curb and forgot to cut off one of the stakes. While screeding the curbing as I was going along, I had to cut off that errant stake that was left there, and my jaw hit the floor as I watched the concrete settle out while cutting off the stake with the oscillating tool. Most of the water was absorbed, not all of it. I had a puddle sitting there. I took a trowel to it, smoothed out the surface, brought a lot of water up to the top. Counterboring those two holes was a bad idea. I did that so I could screed over the top, but they filled up with concrete. I had to scratch it all out. If it had set, I had a tough time getting that block out of there. But you can see a significant amount of water is up on top. So it is set. It is set hard. So it's been 3 hours. 3 hours that I put the trowel to it. So we'll see what that surface comes out. I won't be touching it again or looking at it again. I've got someplace to go. I won't be looking at it again for a number of hours. So we'll see what happens. It's time for the demolding. Here's the first foot wrapped up in a plastic bag to keep the moisture inside so the concrete cures properly and hard. It should be hard enough to demold, but it's going to be a few more days soaking in water for it to get to full hardness. So let's get this thing opened up and see what we've got. My only real concern in demolding this is that center plug. I'm not sure how easy that's going to be to separate, but we'll find that out once we get all of the panels removed. I did notice some of the screw heads had some contamination from the cement bleeding over, so for future castings I'll probably end up putting a little piece of tape over that to hopefully keep them from getting clogged up. As it turns out, I had to clean out 2 of the screws to get them out. As you can see, I had a difficult time breaking the base off of the casting. Much of the difficulty was due to the plug, so I was thinking if I drilled a hole into the base, I could hammer out the plug using a drift pin. And that will be the first modification to this mold. At one point I could see it was actually broken away from the base but stuck due to that plug. It seems as though the plug has adhered itself to the base. Finally busted out of the mold, and we can see that my plastic embossing plate is actually cast into the concrete and doesn't want to come loose. I don't want to put too much force on it right now because the concrete's not fully cured, so we're going to let that soak for a few days before we try to get that out of there. I have foot number 1 in a bucket of water to cure for 7 days so that it gets close to its maximum strength. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and get started on foot number 2 and quickly go through feet number 3 and 4 and what lessons learned during this process. The first thing I learned is that plug had a tendency to stick to the base plate, making it very difficult to demold the casting. In an attempt to resolve this problem, I hollowed out the base, leaving little surface area for the stick together, and we'll see what happens. Getting the form prepped and ready to caulk, and ready to accept another embossing plate with my name, which is going to have a different profile on the letters, and hoping it's going to be able to be pulled out a little easier. Running really fast through the mixing process in my bucket, I'm looking for the absolute minimum amount of water I need to cast these feet. With concrete, the less water you use, the stronger it is. So I'm just looking for the absolute minimum. I already have a bit of water in the bucket, along with the plasticizer and the colorant. And then we'll be adding the concrete mix, and then adding more water as needed till I get where I want it. I do have an idea for an electric 5-gallon concrete mixer, but I never seem to find the time to develop it. The amount of water I started with was the minimum amount as recommended on the back of the Quikrete concrete bag. I started with 8.8 ounces, ended up adding an additional 6.3 ounces, giving us a total of 15.1 ounces of water until I thought I was happy. Once I started placing the concrete in the form, I found that it actually should have been a little wetter. But now, let's get started with placing the concrete. Starting to place the concrete in the form, you can see I've got tape over all the screw heads. This will prevent the cement from getting into the screw head, causing it difficult for it to be removed. I came to the conclusion it was still a little bit too stiff after placing the first layer. I think 2 to 4 more ounces of water would have been good. Going in layers, placing all the concrete, followed up by using the vibrator to settle things down. I have to be careful with this one because I think I have just enough concrete to get in there so there's nothing left to waste. That's it for foot number 2, but I'm going to come back in 30 minutes to see how it's setting. After 30 minutes, some of the water has come to the top and it's brought some brown stuff with it. I am assuming that is a diluted colorant. The colorant I used was chocolate, so that just may be the colorant diffused with some of the water. Lightly pushing on the surface finds that the surface is still very soft and it is not quite set up yet. I think I'll wait another 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, 45 minutes after stopping, there's still a significant amount of water on the surface. Most of this water needs to be gone before I put a trowel to it, so we'll come back at the 1 hour mark. Now at the 1 hour mark after placing the concrete, and we have a nice firm surface. Pushing in, it goes in very little, which means it's set and it's time to put the trowel to it. As you can see, all the brown stuff turned to the same color as the colorant in the concrete, so that was just something that migrated to the surface with the water. After I've run this small and large trowel over it, I'm going to let it set for another hour and then wrap it up in a plastic bag. Then I've got to wait 2 days before it's hard enough, or I'm going to attempt to break it out of the mold, and then starting on foot number 3. Getting ready to pour foot number 3. Foot number 1 has been soaking for a week and is as hard as it's going to get, and it's time to take a look at it. Also, foot number 2 is ready to break out of the mold. Looking at my attempt at branding was a total failure. Some missing concrete around the T, parts of the M still stuck in there, and unable to get any of the D out. I used a different letter profile in casting number 2, and we'll see how that came out after we get it out of the mold. Pulling the last couple of screws and then breaking off the side plates, we get to the moment of truth. How easy is that plug going to be to get out of there now that I have that hollowed out? First I try a screwdriver as a pry bar and it popped right up. And I didn't have to use a drift pin to pop it out. The branding tag stayed stuck to the base, and turning it over, we can see my name was cast in there perfectly. A handful of wraps with a soft blow hammer and the plug starts to come out. After a quick inspection, off to the bucket of water it goes, and time to get started on foot number 3. Here we are pouring foot number 3. Foot number 1 is completed and foot number 2 is soaking in the barrel. I still think I'm a little bit short on the water, but if you'll notice this one looks a little bit darker, that is because I added too much of the colorant. That's a shame because that stuff is the most expensive part of this whole process. Nothing too eventful happens during this one, except I almost forgot to take up the screws, which would have cost me a lot of work. I have also started building some of the other forms that will be needed to build this potting bench. I broke foot number 3 out of the mold, thinking that it was going to go just like the other ones did, but I was wrong. It turned out that that plug in the middle ended up getting stuck to the bottom once again, and it was a pain getting it out. And it actually broke in the process, and I had to do some repairs. Now for the 4th and final foot, we're trying another experiment. I wrapped the plug with boxing tape with the thought that it's probably going to release much easier from not only the concrete, but from the base of the form. Trying to make things a little bit easier, I put the concrete in a smaller bucket right there on the bench. But then, I think the vibration of the form was causing the bucket to settle out and compress, making it very difficult to get the concrete out of the bucket. So, I had to move it over and dump it back into the larger bucket that's sitting behind me. Once I started moving everything back into the larger bucket, I realized the mix wasn't balanced anymore. What was already in the form was going to be a different consistency that's what's in the bucket, and that could result in the form cracking. So, I ended up having to take everything out of the form and start all over, but unfortunately, the video putting it back in the form was lost. The demolding of number 4 went just as expected with one exception. The center plug came out very easy. The boxing tape is a success. If you watch the following videos for putting together the potting bench, you'll see I start using that boxing tape extensively across all the molds. When it was time to pull out the center plug, I used a bolt as a drift pin and drove it right out. This is the end of the series for casting the feet. And coming up next is going to be the building of the forms and casting of the legs. And this is where we'll be using the lightweight concrete. Subscribe and hit that bell so that you will be notified when the videos are posted.